how did a guy from Scotland who came to the States and is teaching at DePaul, how did you get so interested in the neo-Confederate movement?
Well, as you say, I'm from Scotland, and my PhD research was on Scottish-American organizations, Highland Games, and so forth here in the United States. And through that research, I learned that neo-Confederate organizations were beginning to try and pick up support at Scottish Highland Games, particularly in places like North Carolina. There's a large event at Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina every year. And then my co-author, Edward Sebesta, contacted me. He phoned me up and he said, you've got to check this out. And he sent me some information. And because one of the things that really struck me about the neo-Confederate movement was they play up what they call their Anglo-Celtic heritage, and they talk a lot about being of Scottish and Irish descent. They have a Confederate memorial tartan or plaid. They quite often have bagpipes at their rallies. I've seen videos of their rallies that have Scottish flags flying, and what became of concern to me is that my nationality was being utilized in this way. And I'm not a protector necessarily of my nationality, but I think I was really intrigued and interested how Scottishness could become to be interpreted in this way. And so I began to study, particularly initially, their claims to being Celtic. And one of the things that they argue is that the Confederacy was the last bastion of Celtic national identity. After Scotland and Ireland had been absorbed into the United Kingdom, the Confederacy was a kind of a final attempt to establish a Celtic nation, which is an argument you would never hear in Europe, and it's quite strange, and so obviously that's what piqued my interest.
Well, having a little bit of Scot in me too, I always like to think that they were probably good guys over there, and I'm sure they ran the gamut from the miserly, greedy, conservative, kind of what would be called right-wing folks, but also aren't there Scottish workers? Aren't there Scottish leftists?
Oh, yeah.
Tell me a little bit. Just give me a sentence on Scotland.
Well, if you want a Scottish leftist, there's a very famous organizer called John Maclean in the 1910s, 1920s, who was actually the Scottish liaison to the Bolsheviks and was a colleague of Lenin. And they actually had, after World War I, the British tanks left France, were on the streets of Glasgow as they feared a Bolshevik revolution in Scotland in 1919. So there's certainly, you know, all ends of the political spectrum, from you know, the radical left to the conservative right in Scotland.
Well,
but
Euan Hague,
you wouldn't get something like the neo-Confederates there.
Let me ask you a little bit about the conservatization of the neo-Confederate movement. I mean, there's the Sons of the Confederacy. Right. There's all these organizations, Daughters of the Confederacy. There's many of these groups. And there was, in one of the chapters, I think it's the Neo-Confederacy in the 21st century, there is a figure there who was a prominent person in the Sons of the Confederacy, and he basically tried to make it clear in their bylaws that this was not about bringing back slavery. It was not about secession. It was just remembering the people who had fought on the Confederate side. And it seems like in a very systematic way, there were a group of professors, kind of right-wing radical types who moved him out of the organization. Yeah. Can you speak to that, the kind of intra-fighting in the people who want to remember their own heritage in the South, and how it's sort of been taken over by the right?
Yes, certainly. The Sons of Confederate Veterans, which is an organization which has been around for a century or so, what we saw in between 2000 and 2010 basically is a pushing out of more moderate voices, people who were interested in maintaining grave sites and that kind, and more of a social organization. But one of the things that we see around about 2004, 2005 is a radicalization of Sons of Confederate Veterans that a lot of people don't really realize. I mean, people still see the Sons of Confederate Veterans as a relatively benign organization, but actually they're increasingly political. They have set new bylaws. As I say, they've forced out a lot of moderates. They've become entwined with a number of people who 15, 20 years ago would have been called white supremacists, have now begun to get leadership positions in the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and they're begun to publish new materials and really argue that the Confederate struggle is a contemporary political battle. And so Sons of Confederate Veterans has increasingly been involved in doing things such as raising Confederate flags at major interstate intersections in states like Florida, you know, putting up statues to Confederate heroes, most notoriously Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate military leader who becomes the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. And they've started to really push a states' rights agenda and begun to promote the Sons of Confederate Veterans not as a benign organization, but really as an active political organization. And I think one of the things that's happened is most mainstream media outlets have missed that story. The UDC, United Daughters of Confederacy, back in the 1920s, 1930s, was a quite clearly racist organization. But what we've seen now is, again, a recruiting drive and maybe an increased radicalization and the promotion of some of these neo-Confederate ideas through groups like the UDC as well. So whereas the Sons of Confederate Veterans, a lot of their organization members are actually active in writing books, writing magazine articles, promoting these neo-Confederate ideas, they're beginning to be replicated throughout Confederate heritage organizations.
You are listening to Live from the Heartland over WLUW 88.7 Chicago Sound Alliance. I'm Michael James. I'm the host for this morning's edition of Live from the Heartland Radio, brought to you every Saturday morning from the lovely corner of Glenwood and Lunt up here on the stage at the Heartland Cafe. And my guest this morning, my first guest, is Euan Hague, Associate Professor and Chairman of the Department of Geography at DePaul University. Euan, one of the questions I have is, tell me about how geography fits into this. You know, like, I mean, I have a lot of questions, and I'm thinking of them every minute. But one of the things that always, geography used to be just sort of study the terrain and where the boundaries were. Give me a little description of geography that encompasses something like your book, The Neo-Confederacy, A Critical Introduction.
I think there's a lot of misconceptions about geography. I'm always happy to set the record straight. People seem to think we pick up at third grade where other people left off. So we're back onto state capitals and rivers and mountains. And obviously, as an academic discipline, it's a little different than that. One of the things that is interesting to me is nationalism and how nations control territory and how a nation can claim places and claim land and claim space as being the embodiment of that nation. And so the hook that got me into Neo-Confederacy was this effort to claim Confederate space, to sort of carve out in the United States through all types of processes, through writing. We got a chapter on music in there. We have a chapter on literature in there, and also things like commemoration, statues, and so forth. How nations claim territory and give it meaning. And that's really where an aspect of cultural geography, which is what I study. So, for example, another project I'm working on is a continuing effort by the United Daughters of the Confederacy to name roads in the United States after Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president leader, including putting up statues to him in places you wouldn't think about. There's actually a little Confederate memorial park now between Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, which was an effort of the UDC and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Their claim is that Jefferson Davis helped build roads when he was Secretary of War in the 1850s in the United States government. But until 2002, the first statue or monument you saw by the roadside if you drove from Vancouver into the United States was to Jefferson Davis, that had been placed there by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1940s. So this has been an effort to claim territory, claim the United States as a Confederate space. And so this idea of space, place, territory, how claims to landscapes are made is what interests me, and that's what a lot of geographers are beginning to explore now.